Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Mastodon Career Calls. We're going to go ahead and get started, so if you want to take the poll, and we'll go ahead and close those screens out. And it is my pleasure to introduce Christine from our Institutional Equity Office, and she's here to talk to you a little bit about knowing your legal rights and how to spot and respond to illegal questions. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Christine.
Thank you, Ashley, and thanks to Career Services for inviting me to do this Mastodon career call. I hope this topic is of great interest for everyone as they begin job searches for this spring. Welcome to all of our participants. As Ashley mentioned, I'm Christine Marcaselli, and I am the Director of the Office of Institutional Equity at IPFW, which means I oversee the hiring process. So I have that experience. I also am a licensed attorney in Indiana, so I have a legal background. Please feel free at any time during this webinar to ask any questions that you may have. I'd love to address them as the topic comes up. So please feel free to jump in, and I'll try to get to as many questions as I can. So let's get started. Know your legal rights, spotting and responding to questionable questions. What do you do, essentially, if you get a question that you're uncomfortable with or that you think is illegal? Let me remove the poll. It looks like we have a mix of students and staff members and graduate students. Welcome to everyone again. Okay, you respond to the following ad. Company X is looking for an energetic, physically fit, recent college graduate to work in an exciting organization. The ideal candidate will be multilingual and have a passion for seeing a job through completion. Candidates will be subject to criminal and credit background checks. Well, you should notice some red flags in this ad to begin with. So I would caution you to respond to the following ad, but what are some of those red flags? Energetic and physically fit, that could be code for we want to make sure that we don't have someone with medical issues or a disability, maybe for insurance reasons, or they just don't want to deal with federally required accommodations processes. Recent college graduates, that would be a red flag for me, because that could be code for we are looking for young people. We don't really want anybody who's getting too old or maybe close to retirement age or may have medical issues that might affect our insurance. So those couple red flags in that first one. The ideal candidate will be multilingual. Probably okay, but could be a red flag. Multilingual certainly is a valid job function if it's essential to the job. Multilingual, though, that may be code for, hey, we're looking for someone who's international or something like that, something that would be inappropriate to ask about. Passion for seeing a job through completion, that may be code for we expect you to work a lot, and that's okay. That's not illegal. Candidates will be subject to criminal and credit background checks. Those are in a gray area, and we'll talk about those in more detail later on. Okay, so let's say that even despite those red flags, you decide to apply for the job and you get an interview. But during the interview, you should have listened to those red flags, because during the interview you're asked, how old are you? What's your native language? Where are you from? Do you have medical conditions? What does your spouse do? Do you have any kids? Who takes care of them? And a whole laundry list of questions that are really personal and not really related to the job. So what do you do? The first thing, and you're doing it by attending this webinar, and I applaud you for doing that, is to prepare yourself. Recognize illegal or inappropriate questions. What are the red flags? Because you certainly can't decide how you're going to respond unless you know what an illegal question is, or even if it's not illegal, if it's inappropriate, and learn to spot the motivation of that interviewer. Maybe they're not trying to ask an illegal question, but they have inartfully asked you a question that they're trying to elicit specific information. So learn to spot that motivation. Know what job related information is being sought. Do they want to know if I'm multilingual? Do they want to know if I'm committed to my career? What's the question really asking? Is it really trying to discriminate? or is it really trying to find out valid information? And then decide how you will respond. And we'll spend a lot of time in this webinar talking about how you really have some options on how to respond in an appropriate and professional way. So the first step, recognize those inappropriate questions. First thing you should know is there is a federal agency called the Equal Opportunity Commission, and the EEOC, as it's called for shorthand, covers all federal employment, most state employment, all employment agencies, and then any other employer or labor union who has 15 or more employees. So those entities are all covered by the Equal Opportunity Commission. It doesn't matter if it's a state agency, if it's a private business, if it's bigger than 15 individuals employed there, then they are required to follow the Equal Employment Opportunity Guidelines. So what are appropriate pre-employment inquiries? And essentially, those inquiries are limited to the essential, those essential for determining if a person is qualified for a job. Now that's pretty narrow. Now, those of you who have interview experience know that not necessarily every question is specifically related to the job functions, but may be more geared toward, is this person going to fit in? What's this person's personality? How do they think under pressure? Things like that may be tangentially related. And that's where you get the if you were a tree, what kind of tree would you be? Well, that's not an illegal question, and it's probably not even an inappropriate question, not necessarily directly related to the essential functions of the job. So outside the scope of anything essential for determining if you're qualified for the job, appropriate pre-employment inquiries then can be a broad range of things as long as they're not inappropriate, discriminatory, or illegal. What are the really big red flags you should watch for? Questions about disability, medical or genetic information. And the next group of questions to watch for: race, sex, national origin, religion, age, pregnancy, marital or family status, and military discharge. And the third category of questions to watch for: arrest or conviction, credit rating, or height and weight. We'll get into each of these a little bit in more detail. The first category of disability, medical, or genetic information are absolutely forbidden to be asked about during the interview process. The second category, believe it or not, it's not technically or explicitly illegal to ask questions about any of those categories, even though those are protected classes and have the potential for discrimination. However, each of those areas, if a question is asked about, for example, race, that is evidence of discrimination, and for that reason, most employers do not ask those questions and should not ask those questions, and I classify those as completely inappropriate questions. In the third category, arrest or conviction, credit rating, and height and weight. Those can be inappropriate, but they also can be appropriate. And, as I mentioned, we'll go into those in a little more detail a little later on. So all of these have a caveat of there is an exception for what's called a bona fide occupational qualification. And what that is if I absolutely have to hire a man for this particular job because a woman can't do it for legitimate, non-discriminatory reasons, then if it's a bona fide occupational qualification, then I can limit my employment search to those individuals, and I can ask questions about that. So to recap, prohibited or not, disability, medical or genetic information, those three are explicitly protected under certain federal laws. Disability is covered under the Americans with Disability Act as amended, Medical or genetic information is protected under the Genetic Information Act, which is a more recent act. And what those are geared toward is preventing discrimination against people who are able to do the essential functions of a job, and they may need an accommodation, they may be able to do it under certain conditions, but it's really to provide access to everyone who's not as able as every other individual. Disability under the Obama administration has taken an expanded definition. Routine things such as eyeglasses are not covered, but anything that affects a bodily function. So, eating, sleeping, breathing, asthma may be considered a disability. Cancer, any sort of illnesses like that. So it's not just physical disabilities or very visually obvious disabilities. It can be medical conditions. It can be mental conditions. The genetic information, it's prohibited from asking that. The goal, I think, of that act is to prevent employers from discriminating against those who might be questionably insurable. For example, if my parent has Alzheimer's disease, maybe that makes me more likely to have that disease in the future, and we don't want discrimination taking place against an individual based on a parent or a child or some other family member that may have a genetic anomaly. Okay, the possibly discriminatory categories. Race, obviously, whether you're white, black, Asian. Sex, whether you're male or female. Note that gender presentation or identification, sexual orientation are not included on this list. At this time, there is no federal protection for those classes. However, this is where it's important to do your research into your potential employer, because those may be protected under certain policies. For example, at IPFW, gender identity, sexual orientation, those are both protected groups of individuals on our campus, and as a practice, then any potentially discriminatory questions or behaviors toward those groups are prohibited. National origin, where you were born, where your parents were born, those questions could be seen as potentially discriminatory. Same thing with religion. Age, those workers over 40 are protected by the Age Discrimination and Employment Act. Pregnancy, employers cannot discriminate based on whether you are pregnant, have been pregnant, or may become pregnant. Marital or family status cannot discriminate against individuals for being single, for being married, for having children, or for not having children. And military discharge, I'm going to put I probably should put an asterisk by that. Certainly it is an appropriate question to ask if someone has military experience and what that military experience is. It is not appropriate to ask if a person served in the armed forces of another country. It is not appropriate to ask how that individual is discharged. Was it an honorable discharge, a dishonorable discharge? Can't ask to see discharge papers. Then in our allowable category, arrest or criminal conviction. That area gets a little tricky. Certainly criminal background checks are appropriate if they're done on a routine basis and they're not having a discriminatory effect. For example, if an employer does a criminal background check only on people they think have an ethnic last name or live in a certain zip code, because that's a highly racially divided area. Arrest records get a little trickier because certainly an arrest is not a conviction of anything. However, there is nothing patently illegal about asking about those arrests. Credit ratings, and again, nothing patently illegal about asking about your credit rating. It's not a good idea for the employers to ask that, because those types of questions tend to discriminate against certain groups of individuals. such as females and minorities. So those questions are generally frowned upon. Height and weight, that might seem to be an unusual one on this list, but let me give you an example of how asking about height could be discriminatory. If I am an employer and I say, okay, I'm only going to hire people who are over 6 feet tall. Well, the chances are the vast majority of the applicants who are over 6 feet tall are probably men, so it would discriminate disproportionately against women. Same thing against weight. If I set some very low weight limit, I'm only going to hire people who weigh 110 pounds or less, probably is going to exclude a lot of men. What about an internet check, a so-called Google search, or checking for Facebook or Twitter accounts? Those are allowable. Again, all of these have the caveat of unless there's a discriminatory effect. If I only check, if I only Google people who I think are younger for inappropriate behavior. So who does this anyway? These aren't new laws. These have been in effect. Some of these laws have been in effect since the 60s. So it's not like we're talking about this as a surprise to employers and it's something that people haven't caught on to yet. I think everyone pretty much knows, hey, there are certain things that are out of bounds. The first question to think about on how on earth would I ever come across this? Well, is it deliberate or is it unintentional? What you may experience when you go out and interview is that you have an interviewer that's never done it before, or their company only hires one person every couple of years, so they're not real savvy about interview skills. It's not something they do every day. So they may be a little rusty. They may not have kept up on it. Certainly, people in the legal profession should be more up on that, but not always. And I'd like to share an example from my own life. And this was several years ago when I was coming out of law school and looking for a job as a lawyer. I actually had an older gentleman, a lawyer, say to me at the beginning of the interview, "Oh gosh, all these crazy employment laws, I can't keep up with them. I don't know what questions are appropriate or inappropriate. You just tell me if I ask an inappropriate question, and I'll ask a different question." Okay, sure. Well, he then proceeded to ask me about my religion, whether I had a boyfriend or a husband, my stance on abortion, just about every illegal question that he could come up with. And the thing is, I don't think it was unintentional. So trust your good judgment, trust your common sense. Is this deliberate? Is this an effort to put somebody off and find out things that they can use to discriminate? Or is it really just somebody who's inept and not intending to discriminate? And that's where I tell everyone to watch out for those cocktail party conversations. And what I mean by that is, as humans, we like to make small talk. So, there may be some periods of time during your interview, at lunch, or if you have one person who's in charge of the interview taking you to several different people to interview you, there's kind of some downtime. I think a lot of employers have a set list of questions. They might have a rubric for how they hire, and when you're sitting down at the interview table, it's very easy to follow that script. But when you go to lunch or you're being driven around, being shown the facility, it's easier to fall into the cocktail party conversation with, oh, hey, how long have you lived here? Where do your kids go to school? And things that in social conversation would be completely normal and no one would think twice about it, but not appropriate for a job interview. And that's where I usually warn my employers, say, okay, be careful, try not to slip into that. But in assessing whether this is deliberate or unintentional, is this a cocktail party conversation while you're being walked around the facility? And the other thing, look around the environment. What other indicators are there of an inclusive environment? Do you see diversity in race? Do you see diversity in men and women? Do you see obvious things that show that they're complying with the Americans with Disability Act, or their appropriate ramps and elevators? And do your research before you go into the interview. Look at their mission statement. Look at what they value and who they list as clients or customers, and certainly talk with places like the Career Services Office on, is this an organization that they're comfortable with. So after you recognize that there's a possibly illegal question being asked of you, what do? What's your response? And there are 3 basic ways that you can respond. That's to answer, to refuse to answer, or to sidestep that question. And remember, whichever one of these you choose, always respond in a professional manner. Let's start with answer. Now, this is going to be a highly personal decision on when to answer those questions. And going back to my example with the gentleman who asked me the barrage of illegal questions, I answered them. And I kind of already assessed at that point I wouldn't be taking a job, even if offered at that law firm. So my own personal take on it is I'm pretty open. He didn't ask questions I wouldn't have told anybody. I had decided I would not work there based on that and some other things. So you kind of need to do a self-assessment before you go into a job interview. What's my comfort level? What things are completely off limits for me, and what things are, I don't really care whether those are asked or not. And the other is the motivation of the interviewer. If it seems to be one of those cocktail party conversation situations, or if it just is somebody who maybe inartfully asked a question, that might elicit a different response from you than if it's somebody that is deliberately trying to ask you inappropriate things. So a couple ways you can answer. Answer and move on. What is your native language? Not an appropriate question, because it's trying to seek out possibly what your citizenship is, what your ethnicity is, your national origin. But if you could ask that question, you can answer and move on. Spanish. What else can I tell you about my qualifications for this position? Same question, slightly different take on it. Answer and relate it to the relevant job qualification. And this is particularly good when you've assessed the motivation of the interviewer is, okay, I responded to this ad, they're asking for for a multilingual person because the job involves international travel or what. So you understand where they're going with this. They may not have asked it the way they should have, but but I'm okay answering that because I can then move that on in a way that's positive for me. So what is your native language? Well, Spanish, but I'm also fluent in English and French, and that's why I'm interested in a multilingual position, and then you can even expand on that, why those particular languages are good for this position or a good fit for this company. What if you decide to refuse to answer? It's such an offensive question that you just can't go there. It's so highly personal, or you've gotten a sense that the motivation of your interviewer is that they're not going to like the answer and they're going to use it to discriminate against you. Think very carefully before refusing to answer. This can be seen as confrontational, and even though the employer asking those questions is in the wrong. You're in a position of applying for a job. You don't want to burn any bridges in the industry. You certainly don't want to take the chance of being seen as confrontational or unprofessional. So again, before you even go in for the interview, think about what questions would be absolutely off base for you. And second, I would reserve this truly for invasive or offensive questions. And again, that's highly personal. If it's what your national origin is, and that is off limits for you, then there are a couple ways that you can approach refusing to answer. First, ask for clarification. Do you use a wheelchair because you're paralyzed? Well, that's pretty offensive, and that is one of those questions that's completely out of bounds to ask. You can't ask about disability. You can't ask about medical conditions, and I think this probably covers both of those. You can refuse to answer without saying, I refuse to answer that, by saying, well, can you tell me why you need to know that? How does that relate to the job? And that should get your point across, particularly if it's inadvertent. If then you suddenly see a look of horror across the face of your interviewer, say, oh gosh, I didn't, I can't believe that came out of my mouth. I'm sorry, yeah, I don't need to know that, but I need to know because our facility is from, it was built in the 1800s and isn't accessible, or something like that. The other thing you can do to refuse to answer that's a little softer than I refuse to answer that, that's an illegal question. Express your discomfort. Point it out to them in a kind and professional way. So if you're asked, do you use a wheelchair because you're paralyzed? Oh, I'm not comfortable answering that, but I can assure you that I am fully able to perform the essential functions of the job as you've described. And a truly professional and savvy response from that would then move it on away from that topic. And that may be something that you have to kind of practice in your head. Hopefully you won't get any questions that are so offensive that you feel the need to refuse to answer. But it certainly is something to think about before you go into that. Great, I have a question from Zachary. Should I ask about accommodations for disability in the interview or when I get a job offer? Great question. From the employer side of it, the most that they can kind of toe that line of asking about a disability or any sort of accommodations is, are you able to perform the essential functions of the job with or without an accommodation? And if the answer is yes, with accommodation, they may be able to say what kind of accommodation. Most employers won't, because that really touches up against that line. My advice would be to ask about accommodations after the job offer. And certainly a job offer can't be rescinded for a request for an accommodation. And that's really from the job applicant standpoint, that's the safest thing to do, because if you ask for an accommodation during the interview, say, oh, I need a stand-up desk as an accommodation because I have a medical condition. And if you don't then get the job offer, well, maybe it was related to the discussion about the disability, maybe it was not. It won't be clear. And if you bring it up, then if you are discriminated against, then that weakens your position of, like, well, okay, well, I didn't ask about do you have a disability, but Zachary volunteered that information and we didn't want to know it, we didn't consider it. It makes kind of that argument harder to make. So great question. Wait to talk about accommodations after you get the job offer. Sidestep the question. That's going to be the best one. in my opinion, because it's going to be the most effective in in selling you, and it's going to be the most effective in preserving that non-discriminatory environment. So the first thing you need to do, and remember we talked about how to determine the intent of the question. Okay, what information are they really trying to elicit from me? Is it, is it they want to know what my native language is because they want to know my national origin because they don't like people from my country? Or is it they really need to know whether I'm fluent in that language? So determine the intent of the question and reframe the question, or simply answer the intended question. So reframing or asking for clarification might be, what child care arrangements have you made? And so after that question is asked, you can assess and say, well, gosh, I know this job is very project-based, and so I've learned from my research at this company that there are opportunities for overtime. So pair it back to the interviewer. Do you want to know if I can work overtime? I'm completely able to meet the hours and obligations of this position, including overtime. If that's true. If that's not true, you may phrase it somewhat differently. Do you want to know if I can work overtime? I'm able to meet the hours and obligations of the position. However, overtime would have to be discussed on a case-by-case basis. The other thing that you can do to sidestep the question is simply answer the intended question. The question is, are you a U.S. citizen? They want to know, are you legally able to work in this country? The discriminatory angle of that question is, I don't want to hire immigrants, or I don't want to hire people here on a work visa. But they want to know, they want to make sure that you're legally authorized to work in the U.S. So rather than saying either yes or saying I'm completely offended, I'm not going to answer that question, it's illegal, a better way to sidestep the question would be, I am legally authorized to work in the U.S. and can provide appropriate documentation upon hire. And that really gets to the intent of the question. Let's go through a few more examples of how to sidestep some of these questions. What if you're asked, hey, can you give me a list of previous addresses? How long have you lived at your current address? That's not appropriate because again, it goes to the residency in the U.S. So something more appropriate would be, how long have you lived in the area, or do you intend to make Fort Wayne your home, or fill in the city? An employer can ask for a specific address for contact purposes. So sidestepping that question, hey, how long have you lived in such and such neighborhood? Well, I've lived here for 5 years, and I intend to make Fort Wayne my home. Questions about age. They're generally, almost always, completely inappropriate, as is a request for a birth certificate. The caveat to that is during the interview phase, while you're searching for a job, it is appropriate to ask for an employer to ask questions about whether you are old enough to meet hours or work conditions. I don't know if they would apply to anyone on our webinar today, but if you were under 16 in Indiana, you have to be 16 or meet certain hours. You can't ask teenagers to work past certain hours of the night. So if this were a third shift position, it would be appropriate to ask if you meet the minimum age. Don't ask, the question would not be appropriate, how old are you? The question would be, this job has handles hazardous materials or works third shift, so it has a minimum age requirement of 18, or this job involves serving alcoholic beverages, so it has a minimum age requirement of 21. Do you meet that minimum age requirement? That would be an appropriate question. After hire, as far as questions on age, it is appropriate for your employer after the job offer to use your age for any sort of insurance purposes if they're offering you insurance benefits. Arrest record, that is that's one of those gray areas. It's not appropriate to ask about pending charges generally. However, Indiana law does permit questions on pending charges that may be related to the job. So if you are applying for a job that handles money or involves security, anything like that, any positions of trust, it would be an appropriate question for that interviewer to ask if you have any pending charges for fraud or any crimes involving dishonesty. That will vary state by state, so that is something that you might want to look at any sort of state employment commission website before you apply for a job outside of Indiana. But certainly inside of Indiana, that is an okay question. Indiana also limits the time period for which you have to report arrest or conviction to 10 years. So if you're 45 years old and you were arrested on a minor consumption charge when you were 20, that's not something that would be appropriate for an employer to ask about. Family. Generally, any questions regarding the number of children you have, the ages of children you have, your intentions to have a family, and this goes for whether you're male or female. It doesn't matter if you have no kids, 1 kid, 10 kids, whether they're biological, adopted, step, foster, any sort of family arrangement that you can even conjure or that you are living, not appropriate to ask that. And for women, it is not appropriate to ask if you are pregnant, if you intend to become pregnant, or what you would do if you became pregnant. Nothing about childbearing or child rearing. Then that's during the application process. Now, once you have a job offer or you have started the position, it would be perfectly appropriate for the employer to ask about children for when you fill out your W-4, for tax information, for insurance purposes. Are you claim any dependents if you're offered insurance benefits, or if your employer has an on-site child care facility, they could certainly bill that as a benefit without asking if you have any children or whether you would make use of that facility. But then if you did have children and did make use of that facility, then certainly they could ask ages of your children, and anything related to that. Kind of similar answer with regard to marital status. Completely inappropriate for an employer to ask about marital status, whether you are married, going to be married, divorced, widowed, separated, single, in a same-sex domestic partnership, or married by the states that permit same-sex marriage. Completely inappropriate to ask that during the application process. However, after the job offer has been made, after hire, it would be perfectly appropriate for the employer to, again, get tax information or insurance information. Convictions, probably tie that together with the arrest record. Certain jobs may require a criminal background check, and that is okay as long as all applicants are asked. If you present for an interview and you visually appear to be within a minority group, if only the people who visually appear to be within a minority group are subject to criminal background checks, that would be a discriminatory practice. But as long as all applicants are subject to that or for that position, that is appropriate. And again, in Indiana, there is that 10-year period of time. Education. An inappropriate question might be, what year did you graduate high school? Because what is that getting at? That's looking at, okay, let me see if I can figure out how old this person is. How close are they to retirement? Are they protected by age discrimination laws? So that would not be appropriate. However, certainly, did you graduate from high school? Did you graduate from college? Did you attend college? What was your educational experience? Those questions would be appropriate. Disability or medical information. Again, absolutely off limits with that one caveat I mentioned in response to Zachary's question of it would be appropriate to be asked, can you perform the essential functions of your job with or without reasonable accommodations? That should be the limit of the inquiry. Or one way to sidestep the question, if you get asked something about your physical or mental limitations, the way to sidestep that question would be, what function of the job are you concerned with? I can navigate stairs. I can, whatever the specific situation is. So anything that can be related to a specific job function and framed in that way. So try to turn it around from focus on you and your physical impairment to okay, the job requires lifting 50 pounds. I can lift 50 pounds. National origin. There is not an appropriate question that can ask if you were a U.S. citizen, if the status of your visa, but the appropriate question is, as I've given in the example, that you're legally authorized to work in the United States. What about? Let me go through a couple more. Race, color, or ethnicity. Not any appropriate questions that I can think of as by way of example. I suppose if there were a bona fide occupational qualification that required a certain race because of and the example that I can think of is if I'm casting a movie and I need an African American to play the part of Martin Luther King Jr. Maybe I can limit my search to African American males, but generally no comments about skin tone, about skin color, about complexion, any sort of physical indication of race or color. Religion. The way to sidestep that question and determine the intent of those questions, it's certainly not appropriate to ask, are you Catholic? Are you Jewish? Are you Methodist? Are you Buddhist? None of that. The intent of that question is, okay, well, this is a job that may have Saturday hours, or this is a job that may have Sunday hours. So the appropriate question and the way to sidestep that question is to reframe it as yes, I can work on Saturdays, or I can work any days except Sunday, whatever the appropriate response for your situation is. So what about kind of other questions that might be in a gray area, like personal finances? Have you ever applied for bankruptcy, or have you ever gone through bankruptcy? That's probably an inappropriate question, again, because the propensity for it to have a discriminatory effect on the applicant pool um, you know, that may affect lower socioeconomic groups more than others, and so those questions are generally off limits. You know, and those types of questions, if you can relate it, in your mind, to relate it to what job am I applying for? Okay, I'm applying for a job as an investment advisor or a credit counselor. You know, the real question that might be being asked is can you give sound advice? Are you making good judgments? But generally, do you have a bank account? Have you gone through bankruptcy? Do you own your home? Do you rent your home? Those kinds of things, because they have a discriminatory impact on generally women and minorities. Those are not technically illegal, but I would certainly consider inappropriate, and it would be one of those times when I'd say sidestep the question, try to figure out what they're really getting at. Same thing with political affiliation or organizations that you belong to. Not illegal to ask, are you a Republican? Are you a Democrat? Did you vote? Anything like that. Or what organizations do you belong to? It certainly is appropriate as far as an experience level and how they relate to the jobs, to ask about, do you have experience volunteering, or are you involved in any organizations? It's also appropriate to find out if someone is a member of an organization that discriminates. It, as an employer, it would be quite pertinent to me to make sure that I don't hire someone who has an affiliation with the Ku Klux Klan or some other group that is known for discrimination and for hate and things like that. But generally, those types of questions are frowned upon because, and I'm going to go way back to my example of the lawyer that asked me, not only are you Catholic, but asked me if I was pro-choice or not, because he wanted to make sure that he hired very conservative employees, and that type of question, though that one probably was not illegal. It could have a discriminatory effect depending on who you believe are on either side of that issue. So asking those political affiliation questions or those hot button political agenda items, I would really caution you to first know what organization you're interviewing with, and to think about how you would address those. So, and what about photographs? I'm going to move on. I'm going to give this last example. What about photographs? If you're in the interview stage, you're not in the face-to-face interview stage, but let's say you're in the telephone interview stage, or you're just applying, it would not be appropriate for a job ad to request a resume with a photograph, because obviously then they could probably tell your race, they could tell your sex. Now, it would be perfectly appropriate after a job offer is made to ask for a photograph to verify your identity. Okay, what about some other things? What about social media or internet checks? Can my employer or my potential employer Google me? Can they check my Facebook account? You bet, and some do. Again, this is do your homework, research the organization, find out if that's a hiring practice they employ. But there is no prohibition to if I apply for a job, to somebody typing in Christine Marcaselli and seeing what pops up. So be careful what's online, and if there are areas that you consider off limits, don't start a blog that has very inflammatory or potentially politically inflammatory language in it. Now, I would add the caveat of, as long as it's not a discriminatory thing. If I only do social media searches for my younger job applicants, that might be discriminatory. But if I do it for everyone, not discriminatory. Just so kind of a cautionary, be careful what's online. Criminal background checks, again, I think we covered that. Same thing with credit checks. They can be done. They have to be done for all applicants. And with credit checks, as long as they don't have the effect of discrimination. If the credit, okay, we're going to do a credit check and we're not going to hire anyone with a credit score of less than 700. Well, if the statistics bear out that people with credit scores under 700 are more likely to be of a particular ethnic group or a particular sex over the other, then that might have a discriminatory effect. Zachary's asked another question, that can they fire me for something I put on my Facebook? That is one that is being litigated right now. The answer right now is yes. Let me give you an example. If I'm a bus driver and part of my employment contract or the terms of my employment are that I have to be drug-free or I have to be alcohol-free, if I put on my Facebook page me at a party with a joint, that is job related, so I think that certainly would be something that would be fireable for activity taking place outside the workplace and related to my job. It gets a little more questionable if it's not related to the job. So then you would need to look at that particular employer, what their internal policies are, what their internal practices are. Certainly, employee handbooks may cover that. Some organizations may have a so-called morals clause. If you work for a religious organization, there may be an expectation that you don't engage in certain behaviors. So if you have an extramarital affair and you work for a religious organization, whether it's on Facebook or not, that may be something that you could be terminated for. Willie has asked, what if an applicant removes questionable info and photos from their own site, but have friends with questionable info still remaining? How is that handled? That's a tough one, because if it's out there, it's out there. And let me give you a non-internet question related example. What if, back in the dark ages before the internet existed, what if my religious employer found out through a photograph or someone seeing me engage in activity that was contrary to the religious organization's code of conduct? That would be okay. What the internet and Facebook and things like that have done is just made it easier. Back before Facebook, it might not have been as likely that someone would have seen that, or I would have gotten caught at violating the terms of my employment. However, if it's out there, it's out there, and it almost doesn't matter whether it's on your site or on someone else's site. Now, as an employee, I think your response to that is, okay, has your employer verified that was actually you? Is it something that's questionable? Unfortunately, and particularly with private employers, governmental agencies have some different standards, and certainly within private industry, different employers will have different standards on what that is. But if it's out there and it's something that can be found, it's something to be concerned about. So if there are pictures or blogs or anything that you've participated in that maybe you're not so proud of, that was a kind of a what was I thinking moment, I would Google yourself, in all honesty, and see what comes up. And if there's anything unflattering, to the extent you have any control over it, ask those friends to, hey, I'm getting ready to do a job search. Would you mind, making that, put that on private, or would you mind removing that? I don't think there's anyone in the world who hasn't had a lapse in judgment. Some of it's been documented, some of it hasn't. So if you do a Google search of yourself and you find something questionable, then handle it before the interview, or as it comes up. Hope that's answered those questions. That is a tough question, and I think that's an area we're going to see a lot more litigation in, and a lot more development in the law. So until then, I would say be careful what you find online, and what's online before your potential employer does. Okay, a couple other areas I think I already hit on. Height and weight. There's no prohibition to ask for height and weight, as long as it doesn't have the effect of discrimination. And bona fide occupational qualifications. Let's talk about those for a second. It must be job related and have a legitimate business purpose. Well, if I'm looking for a Victoria's Secret, underwear model or a bikini model, I don't have to interview male applicants. I think I gave the example of casting a movie. If I'm looking for someone to play Martin Luther King Jr., I don't have to interview white females. Now, those are kind of out there. I don't know anybody who's applied for either of those kinds of jobs, but there are other more routine jobs, like what about a men's restroom custodian, or someone who takes care of the locker room during games at a university or a high school. Well, that is a legitimate occupational qualification. If there are going to be other males using the restroom or the locker room while the custodian has responsibility to clean it, it's okay to not interview female applicants. Those examples are pretty few and far between, but they do exist. Okay, so we've gone through a lot of these. Minimum age for hours and conditions, it's okay to ask about age. Citizenship and national origin, it is okay to ask if you have the right to work and remain in the U.S. Disability and medical, are you able to perform those essential functions? Marital and family, are you able to work overtime or certain shifts? Military, can't ask about discharge, but you can certainly ask about relevant military work experience. I can't think of any reason that a question about race would be appropriate. Religious questions, only as it relates to can you work certain days or certain hours. Contact purposes for residents, and no questions I can think of that would be appropriate to ask about sex, except for those bona fide occupational qualifications. After the offer, I think I've mentioned a few of these. Tax information, insurance information, photographs, those are perfectly appropriate to ask for after the offer. Documentation of the right to work in the U.S., absolutely, it's required. And any accommodation information. So, hey, I need a stand-up desk, or I need a ramp, or I need a certain kind of lighting in the office. Those would be appropriate to talk about after the offer. Medical exams, if they're for legitimate business purposes, you can receive what's called a conditional offer of employment. And the best example I can give you is if I want to hire an airline pilot, I may not be able to ask him at the interview stage whether he has a disability or a medical condition, but certainly the safety of my passengers in my jet that's going to be flying around the country would make it appropriate for me to screen all of my new employees for vision and for medical conditions that makes it safe for him to operate that plane. So after the offer, medical exams can be appropriate. I noticed it just clicked 1 o'clock, so our hour has expired. Thank you very much for your attention and for your questions. I've enjoyed giving this presentation.